tell you about Pontiac, also known as the Red Napoleon, who was a chief here in Michigan, my neck of the woods, and was a very powerful chief and he knew how to rally his people for battle. Now, this account is coming from a book titled Famous Indian Chiefs. It was printed in 1909, and there are probably about 20 stories of Indian chiefs, particularly impressive ones that were very important in what was going on at the time. So I will be looking at those at another time with you. So I hope that you'll enjoy taking a look at me with Pontiac as I begin. The war waged by King Philip had put an end to all further hindrances to the settlement of New England by the whites, and the hostile Indians had been well nigh exterminated. But as the restless settlers pressed westward, ever westward, to populate the untouched wilderness and to build hamlets and cultivate farms, it was only natural that the Western Indians would view their advance with the same anger that had smoldered in the bosom of the chief Sechems, or chiefs of the Wampanoags. The French in Canada were more peaceably disposed towards what is constantly referred in this piece as the savages. I don't like to refer to them that way, so I'm going to, as I read this, I'm going to just change that with the Indians. So the French in Canada were more peaceably disposed towards the Indians than were the English, and they treated them with some consideration and kindness, sent their Jesuit missionaries among them, and endeavored to teach them the ways of civilization. As the English pressed onward, they were continually in altercations with the various tribes which lay in the path of their steady emigration, and they showed them little consideration, kindness, or toleration. In 1755, war broke out between the French and English for the possession of America. Both were rival claimants on the soil of the New World, and the people of the northern English colonies had learned to regard their Canadian neighbors, the French, as the bitterest of enemies. They hated them because they were of a different religious faith than their own, and they hated them because they were friends of the very Indians who made depredations upon their frontier settlements and slaughtered the peace-loving white settlers. Okay. The Indians were plied with gifts and flattered by the French, so that in the fierce struggle for the possession of America, the Red Warriors sided for the most part with those who held dominion over Canada and the Great Lakes. The English won the war, and thus the wilderness beyond the Allegheny Mountains, over which France had claimed sovereignty, passed into the hands of her rival, who, with a force of but 500 or 600 men, expected to keep it secure. Little apprehension was felt of an attack from the red inhabitants of the woods, and the French had signed a capitulation. The English considered themselves safe in the possession of this new won territory. But they were far from being safe, and much fighting was still to be done before peace and tranquility were to come to the frontier, which Michigan was the western frontier at one time. The furthermost settlement of the English was at Detroit, between Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair, and upon the river of the same name. Now, there were about 2,500 inhabitants in this little community. Straggling huts were along the riverbanks, and in the center was a fortified town called the Fort, consisting of about 100 houses surrounded by a palisade. A British garrison consisting partly of regulars and partly of provincial rangers were quartered in well-built barracks inside the town or fort. They were about 120 soldiers, 40 fur traders, and a few half-breed scouts who could not be relied upon in case of a war with the Redskins. Several light pieces of artillery were mounted upon the bastions, while two small armed schooners, the Beaver and the Gladwin, lay anchored in the stream. The garrison was commanded by a splendid English officer named Gladwin. These names come up in Michigan history. There is a Gladwin here in Michigan, and Beaver, we harken back to Beaver Island, I believe. But at any rate, named Gladwin, whose courage was that of a lion, and whose fighting qualities were far superior to most of the British officers who were engaged in the struggles upon the frontier. A large Indian village of the Potawatomis was on the western shore of the river, a little below the fort, while nearly opposite on the eastern side was a village of Wyandottes, and on the same side, 5 miles away, the Ottawas under Chief Pontiac had fixed their abode. Although the Indians appeared to be on friendly terms with those in the town, the country had scarcely been transferred to the English at the conclusion of the French and Indian War when smothered murmurs of discontent began to be heard among all the Indian tribes of the interior. And from the headwaters of the Potomac River to Lake Superior and along the winding courses of the Mississippi, a deep seated hatred of the English increased with great rapidity. When the French had held possession of Detroit and the forts upon the frontier, they had supplied the surrounding Indians with guns, ammunition, and clothing, but the English would give them nothing. The French had been kind to the Indians when they visited their forts, but the English received them with cold looks and harsh words when, as was their custom, they would lounge about the fort and lazily stretch themselves out in the shadow of the walls, excuse me. This was galling to their proud and haughty spirits. Then, too, the best lands of the red men were being invaded by white settlers, and all remonstrances had been useless. The Delaware and Shoshone, in particular, were highly exasperated at this, and their feelings were shared by all the surrounding tribes, in whose breasts slumbered a terrible hatred and distrust of the oncoming English, who had been their enemies in the late war, and towards whom the Indians had the rancorous enmity that an Indian always feels against those whom he has been opposed in battle. Pontiac was principal chief of the Ottawas and head of a loose confederacy of the Ottawas, Ojibways, and the Potawatomis. He was about 50 years of age, tall, sinewy, and very strong. Over those around him, his authority was almost despotic, while his name was known and respected among all the Indians who resided in the country, stretching from the Ohio River to the lowest waters of the Mississippi. He possessed a great energy, craftiness, and oratorical prowess, while his courage in war was far famed, and it is said that he commanded the Ottawas in the defeat of General Braddock at Fort Duquesne during the French and Indian War, and it is certain that he was treated with much honor by the French officers, for one of them had presented him with the regimentals of a soldier of that country, which he is only known to have worn upon one occasion. And not long before the beginning of the French and Indian War, he had saved the French garrison at Detroit from an attack from some discontented tribes of the North who had marched to destroy it. And for this he had been made, much of by the French officers. He puts on an air of majesty and princely grandeur, and Major Rogers, one of his opponents, and is greatly honored and revered by his subjects. Pontiac saw that the Indian race was now confronted with a grave crisis, for when Canada had become an English province, the tribes had sunk from their former position of importance. Up to this time, France and England, the two rival European nations, had kept each other in check upon the American continent, and the Indians had been flattered by each, for their services were needed by both. Now the English had gained undisputed control of America, and the Indians, being no longer important as allies, were treated as animals of a lower order of intellect who could be trampled upon with impunity. Thus, the mind of the wily Ottawa chief conceived the idea of driving the English into the sea, of once more restoring the French to power in the West, and thus to place the Indians in their former position of influence. The French Canadians continually told him falsehoods, assuring him that the war had not been lost by the French, that the armies of King Louis were now on their way to recover Canada, and that the French and their red allies could soon drive the hated English away from their beloved country. Stirred by these lies and urged on by revenge, ambition, and patriotism, Pontiac decided upon war. The various Indian tribes which lived along the Mississippi in the country of the Ohio River and its many tributaries and along the cold waters of the Ottawa to the north were visited in 1762 by ambassadors from the Pontiac. They carried with them a tomahawk stained red and a war belt of wampum, and As they went from camp to camp, they would fling down the tomahawk on the ground, hold the warlike belt above their heads, and deliver a long speech urging the warriors to join the extermination of the English. And everywhere this appeal was heard, with nods and gesticulations of approval, and all the Algonquin nation, including the Wyandots, the Senecas, and several tribes of the lower Mississippi, pledged themselves to aid in the important movement. Of the powerful Iroquois nation of New York State, only the Senecas would join, but the force against the whites was so overwhelming that it seemed hardly possible that a few scattered English garrisons could escape a terrible slaughter. Yet confident in that supreme race confidence which has made the English the most all-powerful nation since the Roman legions held dominion over the greater part of Europe, the white garrisons of the wilderness kept their posts in fancied peace and seclusion. And I'm going to stop there this time. And when next week, we will continue on with this account of Pontiac and his plans against Fort Detroit. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll come back for the next chapter. Love you all very much on the other side of that monitor. You are a blessing to my heart, each and every one of you. And I hope to be back here real soon, God willing. I will see you soon. Much love to all.